Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in today. We sorry for the delayed start. We're having some severe technical difficulties with Zoom this morning. Alex is still trying to join in as I speak. So we got a lot of questions about the reopening. First, I wanted to talk a little bit about a story I'm working on, and hopefully Alex will be able to get to some of the questions. One thing that I found talking to office employers in Greater Boston is that not all of them are going to be sending their workers back once we're at full strength in terms of the pandemic's over, COVID's gone. They're not going to come back at 100%, and that could have obviously big ramifications for small businesses in the area, for transportation, for the office market in general. What we don't know right now is, are employers going to bring back 90% of their workforce or 50% of their workforce? What we do know is they're going to be much more lenient and flexible with work from home. I think most executives that I talk to are quite surprised that work from home has worked so well, even with technical difficulties like the Zoom call that do come up. I think for the most part, office workers have been able to do their job from home fairly successfully. And so some of them do want to work from home permanently. And, speaking for myself, I do miss the office and I'd rather get downtown ASAP. The Globe isn't going back at least until August, if not later. But the downtown, of course, is not what it once was. And, most offices right now are pretty empty. The city allows and the state allow up to 25% occupancy in offices in this phase, the second phase of the reopening. But most companies still are waiting until the end of summer, and many until the end of the year before they send people back to their offices, primarily a safety concern, and also, to curb the spread of COVID. Like I was saying at the beginning, that what I found, which has been a bit surprising, is that once the pandemic's over, there's a vaccine, there's immunity. People still aren't going to be going back 100%. There will be many companies that will allow more people to work from home, and that's going to have, consequences for the labor market here. I think companies like the opportunity to hire from anywhere now, and they don't have to cajole people to move to Boston, even though obviously Boston's a great place to live. Some people want to live in a less expensive location, and this will allow them to do that. We did get some questions about what the phase 3 reopening is going to look like. It's a great question. Where the plan right now, the hope is that it starts June 29th. What we don't know for sure is whether that's the earliest it can begin. The health metrics in terms of the dissipation of COVID in the area remain pretty promising. So I think we could start as soon as Monday, June 29th. And that'll mean more indoor activities, indoor sports. Gyms in particular will now be able to open. Casinos will be able to open. Between now and then, we're waiting on sort of a part 2 of phase 2, which we will hear more about later this week from the governor. And I think that'll be, all things are pointing to that starting within a week. And that means indoor dining with, of course, social distancing protocols, 6 feet between the tables, for example, and people wearing masks as they walk around the restaurant. There'll be what they refer to as personal services will be allowed. We already have hair, barbers, salons, hair salons have been able to open, but nail salons have not, personal trainers have not, and they will get the okay in part 2 of phase 2. Hopefully later this later this week, we'll know for sure. It's been interesting, the state, as you know, has broken this reopening into 4 phases. And phase 2 was sort of the big one, in which, we really are opening up the restaurants and the retail stores. We still got a ways to go before phase 4. There's supposed to be 3 weeks between each phase minimum, but after phase 3, I think it'll be more than 3 weeks before phase 4, which is when all the big venues, say concert venues, nightclubs, when they open. I'd be very surprised if they open within 3 weeks of the start of phase 3. We also got a lot of questions about what this means in terms of business closures in Boston. And I do think it's, fortunately, we're seeing a lot. There's a framing store right by where I live that just closed, blaming COVID, saying that they can't survive through COVID. The Retailers Association of Massachusetts estimates maybe 7,500 locations will close. That's a mix of independent locations and chains. Certainly, we're seeing a number of chains, big national chains, close. A number of stores. Just today, Fitness 24 said they're closing a bunch of stores. Obviously, with gyms still closed through this stretch, it's been really tough on gyms. I saw yesterday Ulta Beauty, they're talking about closing a number of their stores after pretty aggressive expansion. So we're going to see a number of closures still, even as businesses reopen. Also, restaurants, Bob Lutz at the Restaurant Association told the state Senate on Friday that based on 2 suppliers, the 2 main suppliers for his industry, he expects 3,600 restaurants to not survive the COVID pandemic. And I think that's going to be, that's I'd say it's almost a quarter of all restaurants in the state. That's going to be a big challenge for that industry. I think this might be Alex trying to call in. I'm not really hearing. The signal sounds a little dicey. Sorry about that.
Hey, John. Yes.
Hey, there's
Hey,
Alex.
John. Yes.
Can you hear me?
Hey, I'm here now. It's been about 15 minutes of trying to get into the Zoom call. So
yeah, I don't know
apologies
what's
to
going on.
everyone.
It's been very temperamental today. Sorry, I can't see your smiling face.
Yeah, the only option we had was to call in for audio today. So apologies to you and everyone who's tuned in for the technical difficulties. But I'm just tuning in, so would love to just quickly recap kind of what you covered, and then happy to chime in and add some context from the small business community.
Yeah, great, Alex. So I talked about a story I'm doing about offices that a number of office employers are not bringing everybody back, even after the pandemic. And that's commercial real estate industry is really looking at that closely and wondering what is commercial real estate going to look like after the pandemic's over. And I was getting through some of the questions that we had before the call. One was what phase 3 is going to look like, which could start as soon as the last Monday of June. And also how many business closures we expect to see. Thousands of locations will close, both in retail and restaurant, but also a number of small businesses that aren't in those industries are not going to survive. Unfortunately, it's right now the best we can hope is that that the conservative approach that Massachusetts has taken with the reopening keeps the COVID at bay. It seems to be subsiding. It's going to be with us for a long time. But with the right precautions, maybe we won't get a flare-up again. What these industries can't survive is if they have to close down again. So I know a number of businesses have been upset with the state's conservative approach, but I think the opposite or the counterpoint of opening too early and then causing a flare-up, we are seeing in some other states, unfortunately, would that could be devastating for businesses if they need to close again twice, particularly with, we had the CARES Act that sent billions of dollars out to small businesses. Was passed in March. Right now, I think the big focus on federal stimulus is helping state and city budgets. And I don't know if we would see a huge push out of Washington for another big stimulus package for small businesses as the everything is reopening again.
Yeah, definitely. I know there's been some discussion and some reform out of Washington around PPP and the CARES Act, and I know we had one question that was submitted ahead of time about has the CARES Act done enough to help small businesses? Maybe you want to talk a little bit about anything about some of the changes to PPP, how it might affect those listening or those who might have some questions in terms of repayment and things like that.
Well, the two biggest changes to PPP, which we just had, the Paycheck Protection Program, which was arguably the most important thing for small businesses out of the CARES Act. The challenge was you needed to bring people back on staff by the end of June, and within an 8-week period. And the Congress has recently expanded that to a much longer period of time. You still have to get into the program by the end of June, but there's still plenty of money available, and I'd recommend if people haven't taken advantage of it, that they should, because now it makes a lot more sense for businesses that were. The problem was a lot of restaurants and other businesses were closed during this time, and they would not be able to bring back people in time to be reimbursed through the PPP and have those loans forgiven. The other helpful thing is that the restriction on how much you have to spend on payroll has been reduced, so that you don't have to, your other expenses can count more towards being forgiven. And so this gives a lot more latitude, and it almost becomes more like a grant than a loan. I mean, the idea was for it to be a forgivable loan, but a lot of businesses were reluctant to spend it until these changes came from Congress just in the last couple of weeks. So it's worth revisiting if you haven't done it already. And it's much easier to get the money because there's not this crazy race for cash the way there was when the PPP program first opened up. Definitely.
I'm also curious, based on talking to the business owners that are part of the small business community, and I don't know if you touched on this earlier in the call, but with businesses that were in phase 1 especially, but also phase 2, have you had a chance to catch up with any of the business owners on how that's been going? I definitely see, I went out to eat once and did the outdoor seating, and it was pretty busy. So just curious if you haven't touched on it already, and feel free to stop me if you have, around any successes or pain points or anything like that you're kind of hearing back from the community.
I mean, I think that the loss of revenue is hard to bounce back from. For some businesses, they were out of revenue for 2 months. But I think I have not come across any huge problems with the reopening. There's some question about whether businesses are going to be able to get enough personal protective equipment. The masks and shields and sanitizers. It seems like when I need to buy them, I can find them okay. But I imagine that buying them in bulk can be challenging for some, because it's there's demand, and so the prices go up. So they're still working through that aspect of it. But I think it's been, knock on wood, at least in the Boston area, it has sort of unfolded, hopefully, the way everyone had hoped, had expected. It's just been a painful process because it's so slow.
Definitely. Not sure. Are there any questions coming in the live box? I am not logged in from my computer, so not sure if there's any questions coming in from anyone listening. Are there any?
I don't see any right now. But like I said, I will be honest. The Zoom has been a bit dicey this morning.
Yeah, no worries. I mean, just asking because I can't see.
No, I don't see any.
Let's talk a little bit about, obviously, nice weather the last 2 weeks. Seems like we're going into, peak summer. Questions we've gotten in the past that I feel like, would be more appropriate to address now is more around tourism. I know there's been a lot of reporting on a national level in terms of increase in travel, and airlines are getting busier again. Do you expect that trend to impact areas like the Cape, Boston, Nantucket, things like that? It seems like people are more willing to travel. I've seen some metrics from TSA in terms of number of people screened and stuff like that. Are you hearing anything from the hospitality industry? Because I know that was, the last couple of weeks, we had at least 2 or 3 questions around hospitality. So anything around, improvements, boosts in revenue, anything like that you're hearing or seeing or expect?
Well, what I can say is that the short-term rental industry on the Cape is doing pretty well. That people are picking driving distances. I have heard that airline travel is starting to pick up again. It's just looking at the numbers at Logan Airport. It really, we lost almost 95% of airline travel out of Logan, and so it's going to be a slow climb back. People are flying again. Some of that's business travel. Some of it's personal travel, but I do think that the recreational travel is going to be more limited to cars than flying, and that's a great benefit to the Cape. I am a little concerned what I'm seeing in terms of hotels here in the Boston area. They continue to have layoffs and furloughs rather than opening back up. I'm seeing the trend go the opposite direction. I heard one hotel that apparently is about to lay off a bunch of people, and they were doing really well during the pandemic. I will say, compared to others, they were one of the strongest in the city with maybe a 30% occupancy, which would be terrible any day, but during the pandemic was actually pretty good. So that tells me that the hotels in Boston are really struggling. And I think that I'm not as familiar with what's happening in the hotels outside of Boston, but with the possible exception of sort of the vacation areas of Cape Cod, the coastal communities, which are probably getting better bookings, judging from what I'm seeing in the short-term rental community. I'd be worried about hotels in other parts of the state. We have 2 questions coming in here.
Great.
Do you want me to read one? They both look pretty good. You want me to read the first question?
That'd be great. I can't see
question
the screen,
is, can
so
you
that'd be
speak
awesome.
about the need for flexible office space on the other side of the pandemic, more than just where and when people can work, but also in how landlords think about leases they dole out? If you expect them to give the shorter term leases that co-working was more largely known for to this point. Well, it's a great question. I think the landlords are going to have to be more flexible. First, you probably will see some more shorter term leases. I think landlords are already starting to be a little more flexible at that. As leases come up for renewal, I'm hearing many smaller employers are just not renewing because they don't know what's going to happen. And they're going virtual, and they're staying virtual until things get settled with the pandemic. So that's going to force landlords to be much more flexible with their tenants. The other interesting thing is that we're going to see offices change. They're evolving more to be sort of as opposed to a place where people go to work, it's a place where people convene. And again, like I said, this is going to be post-pandemic, but I think you're going to see a lot more, it'd be more focused on projects and group meetings with more people working from home, or you'll see people rotating in maybe 2 days a week. Some people come in on Tuesdays and Thursdays, for example, and others come in Mondays and Wednesdays. The tricky thing is, and no one's really figured this out, if you have people coming in on different days, it's going to be harder to share the workstations. I think that just the approach to hygiene and cleanliness and sterilization is going to be, even post-COVID, I think it's going to be very heightened. So I think you'll just see a lot of empty desks in some places. And it's going to be, landlords are going to have to be accommodating about that. Another question I got, someone developing a manufacturing facility in Boston. They're adding or updating air handlers to keep fresh air in all the rooms. And any thoughts on what else tenants are going to be looking for in the future for office tech and medical space? Well, it's interesting. It's one thing I'm hearing from a number of businesses that I haven't quite seen addressed is concern about HVAC. I think that's another thing that's going to have to be worked out with the landlords. Some buildings are going to have to redo their entire HVAC system, and that's going to be more on the landlord's responsibility than the tenant's responsibility. Of course, if you're building your own facility, you've got to keep that in mind. I think, any new facility is going to have to take into consideration this physical distancing and this remote work emphasis, even for the long term. And that's something that it's here to stay. I think the labs obviously are going to, people need to come in to work to labs, but maybe we'll see, they won't be occupied 100% of the time. It's going to require a new way of thinking about development, and I don't think anyone's really have a good answer yet to how to do
it. Is there any for non new businesses or businesses that are already established in terms of the reopening regulations? Is there anything around airflow and things like that are required?
No, I haven't seen anything. That's a great question. I haven't seen anything in the building codes about that. There are, I'd be hesitant to say there aren't. The details for each industry, the governor has very specific rules and regulations. There might be some in there. I haven't looked at them since phase 1 opened. I don't remember seeing specifics about airflow, but it's going to be something everybody's that's developing buildings going to have to keep in mind. I did just get a great question about anticipating smaller satellite offices in the suburbs. So this is something that barely existed prior to the pandemic, but it's something I'm hearing a lot of anecdotal evidence about, in that companies want to have offices. They don't want people getting on the train or coming into a building with an elevator. So they're looking at satellite offices right now in the suburbs. Have any leases been signed yet? I don't know, but I know that it's the talk of the brokerage community right now about how this new satellite office system is going to work. The theory is that if you're an employer that maybe say has 500 people or 1,000 people in Boston, well, maybe you'll have an office north of Boston and an office south of Boston, or maybe just one satellite office west of Boston. And that'll accommodate people who want to go into an office but don't want to drive in to the city or take the train into the city, or deal with elevator and crowds in an office tower. So we're seeing some of that, and it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. But like I said, I have not seen a lease signed yet to that regard, but employers are talking to their brokers about whether it's feasible and what's out there and what's available. And I think you're going to see a gradual shift. I think Boston real estate is still going to be a much bigger premium than being in the suburbs, but I think you're going to start to see more interest, particularly in these smaller spaces in the suburbs, in office parks along Route 128. I also think you might see some places that are in walking distance to some amenities like restaurants in the suburbs will also do well. So this is, the example in the question says a 50-person company might instead choose to have 5 different small offices built around employee geography and leave the crowded downtown entirely. I don't know if I will see 5 different smaller offices in that case. I do see an example of where you might see 5 or 10 people go to 2 or 3 offices in the suburbs rather than 5. So I do think this surge into the city that we saw in the last 5 years is going to change, and we're not going to see such demand to be in downtown Boston. I think employers are still going to want to be in greater Boston because the talent pool is here, but I do think that the habits of this flood into the city of suburban employers, I think that is over. I don't think we're going to see an exodus from the city necessarily, but I do think as leases come up, I think especially businesses that are looking to watch their rent are going to look to where their employers live, and are going to be more focused on accommodating them than being downtown. I think that the whole idea of being downtown was to attract younger workers, and now they'll allow those younger workers to work from home and only have to go out to their office, say, once a week. The company is going to be so much more flexible with work from home that this will, I think, untether some of them from being in expensive downtown real estate.
Definitely, yeah. It's no timeline for sure, or no one really knows what the future of the city looks like in terms of all the foot traffic downtown at lunch hour, rush hour, stuff like that. It's going to be a long road to recovery to get to that point, if we get to that point. But it's definitely going to be an interesting thing to keep an eye on. Jon, I know I joined a little late. Apologies again to everybody. Anything else that you want to close? Anything else on your mind that you want to?
I did just get a question about employer liability in terms of allowing employees back, and companies are loath to say this on the record, but I do think it is holding back the return to the office. I think you're going to see. I think right now there's a push in Washington to have some sort of broad liability protection for companies, particularly on the Republican-led Senate. And I think employers want to know that they're not going to get sued if someone gets sick. They want to make sure they're not going to get sued for age discrimination, for telling someone they have to stay home, because they're a certain age that might be more vulnerable to COVID. And so until that gets worked out, until employers are more comfortable with the liability questions, the workers' compensation insurance is supposed to cover you if you get sick on the job, but that's often hard to prove where you caught the illness. That's still, employers are still liable, and that'll affect their premiums. So there's a broad concern in the employment community. There are a number of business groups have written both to the federal delegation for Massachusetts and to everyone in the legislature saying you have to address liability. We need some more assurances that this can be resolved before the economy can reopen fully. And that debate is taking place in Washington now. On the House side, if you had to simplify it, the House Democrats want to see more assistance for cities and states, and the Senate really wants some sort of corporate liability protection. And when that gets resolved, I think companies will feel a little more, they'll feel better about being able to send people into the office again. They still want to make sure that what the executives tell me is that they don't want their employees to be sick. They don't want their customers to get sick, but they also want to know where they stand in terms of litigation, and that we've already started to see lawsuits of various types get filed. It's a legal minefield right now, and employers are definitely concerned about that.
Definitely. Honestly, that didn't really cross my mind. That's a great question. Anything else pop up in the chat?
No. Well, I have to say I did get a good question about someone had asked how to verify legitimate applicants for pandemic unemployment insurance, because there is some fraud going on. That's a little bit outside of my bailiwick, so I'm sorry that I can't answer that. What we have now is an entirely new unemployment system that's been set up almost virtually overnight. And unfortunately, as is human nature, there'll be some that are going to try to exploit that. I know that the state is certainly concerned about unemployment fraud. They've seen it and they're trying to address it, but we're still hearing examples of it happening. Unfortunately, I can't really address the best way to fix that problem. I think we got
Totally understand.
one more question. This person works in public relations, and they're curious what trends or topics we're most interested in covering going ahead. I think the stories that are going to be most interesting are stories about how the businesses, businesses come up with innovative ways to get through this tough time, through this challenging period. And we've seen some stories about that, but I think there's still so many more hurdles ahead of the business community that the successful ones, I think people are going to want to hear about, as well as some of the ones that were not able to pull it off. Well, I think that's it for my time. Thanks so much for tuning in. I don't know, Alex, if you had anything else you wanted to add?
No, I mean, apologies again for joining a little bit late. Glad I was still able to make it on for the second half. Always appreciate your time, John, and everyone tuning in. Hopefully, this is the first time we had any serious technical problem, which I think is pretty good for the last 2 months or so.
Pretty good record.
Yeah, not too bad, but we'll bounce back. And once again, just appreciate everyone's time, everyone's questions, and appreciate your time, John. Thanks a lot.
Yep. Thanks a lot for tuning in, everybody.